Welcome to the Nonfiction Writers, podcasting in a great way. I'm Ryan Aber, joined by Jason Kersey. Still pretty fresh what happened on Saturday down in Dallas with OU beating Texas. A lot to take away from that, both positive and negative. What was the number one thing that stood out to you?
Well, I think just the lack of offensive success is just stunning. I mean, especially after what we saw in the Sugar Bowl and then early in the season. In the Sugar Bowl, obviously Trevor Knight had Jalen Saunders and LaColton Bester and some of those guys. So, I mean, we knew that there would be some transition period for him. But I think the thing that surprised me is just that they haven't progressed from where they were early in the season. They've, in fact, seemed to regress. Now, part of that, obviously, is due to the fact that TCU and Texas are two of the best defenses they might face all year. But on the other hand, you would have expected somebody else other than Sterling Shepard, and I feel like we keep talking about that, but somebody else would have stepped up, and they just haven't to this point.
Yeah, and it's hard not to keep talking about it when it keeps not happening. I mean, you didn't see really anyone even get close to breaking through the other day. Blake Bell had some good plays. Other than that, not much really going on with secondary guys. Of course, there wasn't much going on in the passing game, period. But Bob Stoops alluded earlier on Monday that there was a chance that there could be changes, and that's not something he's really been open to, at least publicly, to this point.
Yeah, no, he hasn't, and he's got options. And one of the things that he's said is that, the guys that aren't playing and think that they maybe should be playing, they just haven't done the right things in practice, and we got to see it in practice before we're willing to give you a shot in a game. On the other hand, and he really kind of sung a different tune today. He didn't talk a whole ton about it, but he did say that maybe they're going to look at putting some different guys in there, and I think there are options between Austin Bennett is a guy who we heard a lot of good things about in the spring, had a good spring game. Jordan Smallwood is somebody that again, we've heard a lot about. Redshirted last year, the former Jinx guy. So there are certainly options there, and I think that they're going to have to start exploring some of those.
Yeah, definitely. They've got to figure out something else. Sterling Shepard didn't have the kind of game that he's had the last 4 weeks, and that doesn't speak at all to the game he had on Saturday. It speaks to how well he's been playing entering that. 63 receiving yards and a touchdown, a big touchdown in the third quarter that got OU's offense going finally. Also had one big run, a 25-yard carry, or a 31-yard carry, wound up finishing with 25 yards on the ground. But they've really got to get him some help, and Trevor Knight has to get better about finding other receivers, progressing through his reads, and making good decisions.
Yeah, I mean, he has to, and it's funny, Bob is so unwilling to say anything negative about any of these guys, individually, and I think that's interesting. I don't really remember that being something that he's stuck to quite to this level until this season. I feel like in the past he's been a little bit more willing to say things about individual guys, but this year it's almost like he's unwilling to say anything bad about anybody individually publicly, and in a way you have to kind of admire that. On the other hand, I think that there are certain fans out there, a lot of fans out there, who would like to hear him acknowledge the obvious. Otherwise, it sort of comes off as condescending when he, it makes it seem like he's saying, well, the fans don't know anything, and there are some things that you don't have to be a football X's and O expert to know.
Yeah, and one of those things that it seemed like I don't know if condescending is the right word, but came up a lot today was the zone read stuff and Trevor Knight running it, and if he's making the correct reads all the time. Clearly something's happening there, because he's almost always, really always at this point, pitching the ball, getting rid of the ball, and there's some back and forth and discussion with some members of the media today over whether he was making the correct reads all the time, whether it's just that the reads coming up to give it away. What's your take on that?
Well, he and Trevor Knight both sort of said that it's a lot of times it's the give read. Again, I'm not going to pretend to be the X's and O expert that Bob Stoops is. At the same time, you can watch some of these games and see their time. The zone read isn't all that complicated when you look at it. And a lot of times it seems like the defensive end is crashing, and if that happens, he's supposed to keep the ball, which makes you wonder either A, is he not keeping the ball, or is he hesitant to keep the ball because he's been told so much he's got to stay healthy, or are they designing these plays to look like zone reads when they're really not zone reads? And further, is it a matter of play calling? He won't out and out criticize Josh Heupel either, but you got the sense today that he understands that Trevor Knight brings a whole new element to the game when he's unleashed, when he can run with the ball, and they haven't let him do that to this point this year much. And it's becoming very clear that, especially lacking a lot of elite big time playmakers, receiver, Trevor Knight is not the kind of quarterback that's going to be able to win games with his arm, but he can with his legs, and he can when he's on the move. And I think that maybe Stoops is coming to that realization himself.
And he acknowledged also today that there is some trepidation about putting Knight out there, and he's talked about it a little bit before, but I think today in the most direct way, that there is trepidation about exposing Trevor Knight as much to injury because of what happened last year and because what they think could happen if Trevor Knight goes down with an injury.
Yeah, and I think that's very clear. I mean, early in the season, it would have been, I might not have been totally smooth and easy, but it would have been a lot easier for them if they could have just inserted Blake Bell. But now they're 6 games into the season, and Blake Bell is very firmly a tight end. I don't see how they could do that now. So now they would have to rely on Cody Thomas, and from what just from the way that they talk and from the unwillingness to let him run, I'm not sure they have a whole ton of faith in him. On the other hand, anytime you lose your starting quarterback, to an injury, you're not going to win the national championship unless you're Jamel Holloway and Troy Aikman. You're not going to win the national championship if you lose your starting quarterback. And so, at some point, I think they just have to sort of take that risk.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like maybe this is the point where you decide to roll the dice and you've got to hope that Trevor Knight stays healthy, but you've got to get what you can get out of him on the ground because clearly something's not working with this offense. And with Kansas State looming this week, with Baylor looming a few weeks after that, OU still has a lot to play for, a lot of its goals in front of them, even with the one loss to TCU. But it seems like it's time to put that up and just push forward and hope for the best and not worry so much about Trevor Knight getting hurt when you run him through those things.
And it's almost like they were trying, I think maybe one possible explanation would be they were trying to wait as long as they could before they take the leash off of Trevor Knight, because they've seen, we've seen in the past when a running quarterback is allowed to do everything that he can do, sometimes by the end of the year he's so beaten up that the offense suffers. I think the perfect example of that is Zach Robinson, a guy who was early. It seemed like every season early in the year he looked really, really good, dynamic, the things that he brought to the offense, but by the end of the year he was a shell of himself because he'd just been beaten all to hell for the whole year. And I think in 2009 when Oklahoma State comes into Norman with a perfect opportunity to clinch a possible berth in the Fiesta Bowl, and they lose 27-0 because Zach Robinson was completely unable to do the things that made him so successful because he was so beaten up. And maybe these coaches were just waiting as long as they could to do that because they thought they could. And early in the season, it looked like that was working. They didn't really need it for the first, 4 games. But now they do, and maybe this is earlier than they wanted to try trotting some of that stuff out.
And as good as Samaje Perine has been, and he's been fantastic, second in the Big 12 in rushing right now with almost 95 yards per game, and that's including the games when Keith Ford was OU's number one rusher for the first 3 games of the season. But how much is the Sooners offense missed Keith Ford and how much they need him back just to give them a different element. We've talked about his job catching the ball out of the backfield. He obviously lessens the load on Samaje a little bit as well.
Yeah, I think that the where he's missed the most is his pass catching skills. I mean, and then obviously it's good to have somebody else you can put in there that takes a little bit more pressure off of Samaje. But I think that the biggest place where he's missed is in the pass game, because that's another person that Trevor Knight can throw the ball to, and those are kind of few and far between right now. But it's funny, we were talking with Samaje earlier about when he was recruited here. He looked at an OU team and he was pitched this as part of the recruiting process. We're not going to beat you up. We're going to have a committee. This is what we do now for the most part. I mean, and they've done for several years. Really, even when Adrian Peterson was here, they had Kejuan Jones. Obviously, Adrian played way more than he did that first year. But Adrian Peterson's really the last guy that they hammered home like this as much as they have. And so this isn't quite maybe what Samaje signed up for. I'm not saying he's complaining. I think he likes it. I think he likes what
absolutely.
he's doing. I just think that it's been surprising that they have a guy that they're doing this with. But that's partially been due to the fact that Keith Ford's been hurt. And Alex Ross is a great kick returner, and he's fast, and he's and sometimes when he gets into space, but he's just not a between the tackles kind of guy. I mean, that much is very clear.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that when you watch him run. But going to Alex Ross and the kick return, this game was the second game for the Sooners this season where a big-time kick return by Alex Ross for a touchdown. It was the West Virginia game, and then in the Texas game, really shifts the momentum of a game completely in the first half.
Yeah, I mean, it's huge. I mean, against Texas, OU's defense just gives up this long, exhausting drive. Even though it was only a field goal at that point, it was a little bit surprising. And then Alex Ross brings it right back, gives OU the lead. I mean, Trevor Knight steps on the field for the first time at 6 minutes to go in the first quarter, and he's got a 4-point lead. So, I mean, that's huge. And I think OU probably would have won this game anyway Saturday, even though they wound up winning by less than 7 points. I still think they would have wound up winning without the kick return. It's just, but I think the even bigger one, in my opinion, I think the West Virginia kickoff return, that completely destroyed, that killed their will, that broke their back.
Yeah, it looks like West Virginia is going to go into halftime with the lead, and then
and boom, and then it's they get that happen. That happens right before the break, and so. But both of them were just absolutely huge plays and game-changing plays.
And it gets overlooked some with everything else that happened on Saturday, but Ross had a chance to take another one back. He broke through, didn't have any defenders in front of him, just couldn't quite keep his balance as he danced along the sidelines.
Yeah, he was close. It was kind of amazing, and it was funny after the game when somebody asked Stoops, are you surprised teams kicking to him? And I think his answer was, well, I mean, what else are they going to do? Kick it out of bounds? And frankly, that might not be a bad idea.
35 might be a good place to start when your option is putting the ball in Alex Ross's hands. Jason, moving to the defensive side of the ball, some encouraging things to take away from the Texas game. Jordan Phillips' play, I think, up front was really good, regardless of whether he was getting double-teamed or not. And then on the back end, Zach Sanchez had a breakout kind of game, which is funny to say for a guy who has as many interceptions as he has, but really outside of that had a phenomenal game as well.
Yeah, I mean, he really did, and it was a nice bounce back for him as a guy who, had the shoulder injury. He had really not played well in a couple of games, and for him to come out and, I mean, really have a pretty exceptional game for the most part. I mean, I don't remember any huge moments where he got beat badly on anything, just off the top of my head. Obviously, he had the pick six, which was huge at the time. I really think him and Alex Ross, you combine those two things, and right there's your game in many ways. So a huge performance by Zach.
Yeah, I went back and yesterday watched every defensive play, specifically looking for Zach for what I wrote for newsok.com for Sunday night and Monday morning in the Oklahoman. But it seemed like his worst play, if you could call it that, was a play on the first drive where he sort of overran a guy and guy got a few extra yards. But you talk about all the positive things he did. Had on the first drive a third down in the end zone. He makes a really good play to keep the ball away from the receiver that held Texas to a field goal on the opening drive. You mentioned the pick six, which he made a really good play on, read the route, jumped it, came back over 40 yards for the touchdown. And then late in the game on Texas' last couple drives, even on plays where Texas got a lot of yards. They had a 41-yard reception at one point. I believe it was Ahmad Thomas got beat in coverage. Sanchez comes from off the play, runs down the field and makes the tackle. Got him at the 5. Eventually Texas scored a touchdown, but made Texas run a couple more plays, which obviously helped at the end when Texas gets the ball with 18 seconds left. Plus, you never know what's going to happen. And then on another drive there at the end, he comes up and makes a couple critical plays. Now, the rest of the defense didn't really help him out much there on those drives, but Sanchez just making plays everywhere against Texas.
Yeah, he really was. And I think for him, too, you always hear about players, and they say this all the time, playing with a chip on their shoulder. And that sort of, I think that phrase kind of gets overused a little bit. But I think in his case, it's very accurate. I think that, he takes the criticism personally. You see it on Twitter. He favorites most of the tweets that get sent to him that are negative, and he responds to a lot of them. So you can tell just in talking to him that he takes that stuff very seriously. He doesn't like to disappoint people, and again, I think he takes some of it personally, and I think it works for him. He's able to feed off of that, whereas I think some people say that, but they really don't feed off it quite like they say they do. But for him, I think that's completely accurate.
Yeah, I think you're right on there. There's no doubt that he feeds off it, and the way he played certainly illustrates that. And I think the way he played also illustrates that he's right finally about that shoulder being healthy. It gave him so much issues, and I know he tried to downplay how much it was bothering him, although he did admit that it was a problem. But clearly that's something that took him a while to get over, and now that he is, we're seeing the Zach Sanchez that we thought we saw at the beginning of the year, and that has made so many plays, not only the interceptions, but the other plays he's making on the defense.
Yeah, and that's the thing too, is the shoulder. I sort of thought that this would be an issue that would plague him the rest of the year, and clearly it's not bothering him anymore. So I think that's a really good thing for OU's defense, that they have a healthy Zach Sanchez back.
Yeah, it's a really good thing for OU's defense, not only to have him back, but to have him back going into this week when he's going to be so critical to what they're doing on the back end. Playing Kansas State, Tyler Lockett gave OU all kinds of fits last year. Cortez Johnson might still have nightmares about that.
Yeah.
And clearly he does. But last year, this was a strange kind of game because Tyler Lockett had the monster first half, 206 yards receiving, I believe it was, in the first half of football. Then they bring Colvin out permanently. They played him a couple plays in the first half, but didn't play him very much because of his shoulder issue that was bothering him. But Colvin played really well. Zach Sanchez, I think that made K-State do some different things, and that helped led to Zach Sanchez finally breaking through on the interceptions board. And he was a guy who, sort of like Hatari Bird right now, seemed to get a lot of balls thrown his way, just couldn't quite wrangle one, and then he did, and now he's had, only 2 games since where he didn't have an interception.
Yeah, that game was crazy. I mean, Tyler Lockett was unbelievable in the first half, and really, since that game, I don't know that Cortez Johnson has even been back on the field on defense. Now, I could be wrong. He might have been on the field a little bit early this season or late last year, but I don't remember seeing him again after that. And that game was absolutely devastating for him personally, but also for the OU defense. I think as a whole, they really that was a pretty embarrassing first half of football for them, and so clearly Zach Sanchez will be a key part of trying to slow down Tyler Lockett, who is an unbelievable player. It's still crazy to me that he dropped a touchdown pass in the Auburn game because that guy just is so good. You don't expect to see things like that. Although I guess not everybody can't be perfect.
Yeah, and how do you think OU's defense has to fix this third down issue? They have been pretty good overall, but struggled on third down the last 2 or 3 games even. Giving up some busts. There's some busts in the coverage, some different things like that have led to, and it's not always third and short that's getting converted here. How do they fix that? I
don't know. We've asked that question, and the answer we usually get is, well, we'll just line it up in practice and practice it. But that's I just don't think that – I don't see how that really fixes it when it's not in a game situation. I just think teams are figuring out ways to convert these third downs, and really it's been a problem. Third downs have been a problem on both sides of the ball. They're having trouble converting third downs on offense. We saw that against Texas, where they didn't get one till very, very late in the game when they needed it. So it's an issue, and these are smart coaches. They know a lot more about this stuff than we do. So I'm sure they'll try to find ways to figure it out. But they definitely need to, because that could come back to bite them, particularly if late in the season they're still in this college football playoff hunt, and and big plays from Baylor or whoever down the road this weekend against Kansas State. All these teams are going to be challenging for them on third down.
And you mentioned Baylor, and I think it's important with everything that happened this week in the Big 12 to look at the conference as a whole. How much differently do you view the Big 12 now than maybe what you thought about the conference 2 weeks ago before TCU beat OU and before last weekend happened?
That's tough to say. I don't know. I thought the Big 12 was a better conference than maybe nationally it was perceived as being. I thought that early in the year. And I still think that. I think maybe these last couple of games have sort of helped showcase that the Big 12 is maybe in better shape than a lot of people thought. I mean, TCU beating OU, and then they should have beat Baylor. I mean, man, they should have beat Baylor. So, you got that team. Even a team like Texas Tech that got rocked by Arkansas. They almost beat West Virginia, and we know that West Virginia is a good team. I don't think their only 2 losses this year are to Oklahoma and Alabama, so we know that they're a good team. So it's sort of a weird thing. I think the last couple of weeks have been good for the Big 12, but that's just my opinion, and I try not to be biased, but maybe living in this part of the country, it's it's a little easy to get wrapped up in what you're surrounded by and what you see every week. But I've got to believe that the Big 12 comes out looking pretty good.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think with the job that TCU's done and the job that other teams have done and hanging with outside of the conference teams, like you mentioned, West Virginia, obviously they hung with Alabama. Oklahoma State hung with Florida State, who's still among the top couple teams in the country. But watching TCU compete with beat OU, then compete with Baylor and have a chance in that game late, and gosh, I bet they're kicking themselves today for the way that they let that game slip away, because they would have been right up in this national championship talk with all the rest, and they would have had the toughest 2 teams in the Big 12 in their rearview mirror at this point. Mm-hmm. But how do you think the Big 12 shakes out from here? Now, Baylor is atop right now. Baylor and Oklahoma State, both with no losses there. TCU and OU there right behind them, and West Virginia. Do you still feel like it's Baylor and OU as the 2 teams? Do you think Oklahoma State has a shot to break through that? Does TCU still have a chance to bounce back?
I think TCU and Kansas State are the two outside of OU and Baylor that I give a chance.
I didn't even mention Kansas State there.
I don't see Oklahoma State as a Big 12 contender at this point. I mean, they have not been impressive in a while. They were pretty good, against Texas Tech late, but they struggle some with Iowa State. They almost lose to Kansas this last weekend. Needed a big kick return from Tyreek Hill to pull that game off in Lawrence. So I don't view Oklahoma State as a legitimate Big 12 contender, at least right now. I still think TCU is. Gosh, that game just slipped away from them. And the other thing is, I think that coming back to nationally, the perception, I think of OU specifically, I think that they're obviously helped by the fact that TCU lost, but the fact that they lost in Waco and only lost by 3 points in a game they should have won, I think makes OU look better considering they lost in Fort Worth. So, but to me, I think that it's sort of a 4-team race right now, and I'd be surprised if anyone outside of that 4 won the Big 12.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with you on that. I still look for one of those 2, Baylor and OU, and then K-State and TCU, I think, are both really good at this point. But Kansas State, what do you make about their season to this point, and what's the one thing outside of slowing Tyler Lockett down that Oklahoma needs to do to be successful in this game?
Well, I mean, I think they need to establish their run game, obviously. Kansas State has a tough defense. I also think that they've got to contain Jake Waters, and that's something that they struggled with Trayvon Boykin. They struggled some with Tyrone Swoops. I think that these mobile quarterbacks give them some trouble. Jake Waters is an outstanding quarterback, and he's good on his feet, and I think that keeping him in check is going to be key. If they can't do that, I don't know that they can win. And we know that Kansas State can win in Norman. They did it 2 years ago.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. No team, I don't think, has had the consistent, I don't know if success is the right word, but has been able to handle the environment in Norman quite like Kansas State has done. They did it a couple years ago. They've been really successful against OU. Obviously, Bob Stoops and Bill Snyder have a history that runs very deep. But in going to that, were you surprised that we didn't get as much Bill Snyder, Bob Stoops questions as it seems like we have in the past at the press conference today? There was really one, and it was sort of, I don't know, I hadn't heard some of the things he said before. It was at least framed in a different kind of way. Yeah,
I was a little surprised because you can sort of count on every year, when OU plays Kansas State, that we're going to get a lot of the same questions about, Bill Snyder and Stoops remembering what it was like to work for him, what Bob learned from Bill Snyder. The story about Bob trying to buy him dinner when he was watching film. I think I've heard that story 10 times. So yeah, I mean, I was a little surprised. Although, I guess I'm not really surprised because there's so many other things to talk about after a loss to TCU and then a tough, near miss against Texas. So maybe I'm not so surprised by it.
And Jason, it's very early in the week, and we'll have time. I say very early. We'll have the next day or two to hash through our feelings about this game before we make our final determinations on picks. But what are your early thoughts on this game against Kansas State, and who comes away with a win, and what kind of game it is?
Oh man, my early thoughts are that this is going to be a really, really tough one for OU. I think that they could definitely lose it. I said in my post-game blog the other day that if I was forced to pick, that would have been Saturday night, that I would have taken Kansas State. That I would take Kansas State to win. Nothing's really changed my mind in the last 2 days. I do reserve the right to change my mind by the time we podcast again on Thursday when we'll announce our picks. That'll be after we have to have our picks for the paper in by Wednesday afternoon. So, a lot can change between now and Wednesday afternoon, at least in my mind, because I change my mind a lot. But right now, I would probably take K-State.
That's interesting, and we had talked about it a little bit, so not altogether surprising. But I think it's going to be a very tight game. I think it's going to be overall pretty low scoring. I actually picked OU Texas to be a high scoring, but based on what everybody else was saying, I think a much higher scoring game than a lot of people predicted, and I feel pretty good about my prediction there. But I think this game is going to be a much lower scoring game, and I think I haven't decided yet who I'm going to pick. We'll make that announcement on Thursday during our selection, but I think OU is going to have to do a lot of things a lot better than they did both against Texas and against TCU to be able to come out with a win.
Yeah, and I do need to say in terms of predictions, I could not have been more off in my bold prediction for the game. Man, I said Deron Neal was going to have 100 yards. What a stupid prediction that was. We've been so hit or miss on those things this year.
Yeah, 2 catches, 24 yards, 22 coming on one play. So not quite there. Mine almost hit. I had 2 defensive touchdowns. They got one with Zach Sanchez. They had another that was overturned, some say wrongly.
Yeah, I don't think so.
After watching the replay and watching the game yesterday and finally seeing it more than just the once, I think it was the right call. It was a little bit tough to make the determination given the fact that they didn't have an angle that showed his knee was on the ground, but you can tell his knee is on the ground when that ball comes out. But still an alert play by Ahmad Thomas to keep ripping at the ball and keep being persistent at that, even though he appears to be down. Ahmad Thomas stuck with it even without the whistle and finally was able to shake it loose.
Yeah, definitely.
So, all right. Well, that's all the time we have left for today. We'll be back on Thursday with another episode of the Nonfiction Writers Podcasting in a Great Way, and we'll have a special guest from Kansas State. But check us out every day at newsok.com and every morning in the Oklahoman for the best OU coverage anywhere.